Hi, I want to talk about quadratic equations. So we are very familiar with this kind of equations. We have done that in the junior class. We have also looked at it in our XS1 class. So here we want to treat these quadratic equations in details. But what we'll be looking at is the method of solving it. When you have a quadratic equation and you want to solve this equation, so you want to learn how to solve it using the method of completing the square. But before we go to that method proper, there are things that we need to build up. There are some foundations we need to lay before we now handle this method of solving quadratic equation. So you recall that ax squared plus bx plus c equals to 0 is a general form of a quadratic equation. Now you recall that supposing you have that a number a times b and you are told that is equals to 0, there are possible things. One could be a is equals to 0. Another possible thing that will happen could be that b is equals to 0. Then the final thing that is possible is that both of them are zeros. That is, you have that a is equals to 0 and b is equals to 0. So these three possible cases will give us this. So whenever two numbers multiply themselves to be 0, it means that either of them is equals to 0 or both is equals to 0. You can even make these three conditions to be two conditions. So you can combine 1 and 2. Then the third one becomes the second condition. So these are things that is possible. So, but the question is this: where do we apply this kind of thing? We can apply this in solving a quadratic equation. So let's take a look at this. Supposing I have something like this. I have x plus 2 times x minus 4, for instance, and this is equal to 0. You agree with me that this is a quadratic equation, is it? It is a quadratic equation because you have x here, you have x here. Then if you multiply them, you start having x squared, right? Then you collect like terms, you start having the other parts. So with the presence of this degree 2 tells you that it is a quadratic equation. So this is a quadratic equation. So to see it clearly, the only way you can see it clearly is when you open up the bracket, you multiply it, you collect the like terms, you see it will appear in the general form of a quadratic equation. So now, we want to apply the method of a times b equals to 0. So this could be your a, this could be your b. So the bracket there means multiplication, and this being equals to 0. So it conforms to what we are saying. Remember, there are possible cases. We take the first case. We assume that a is equals to 0. So you assume that a, this one, x plus 2, is representing our a. So you assume a to be equals to 0. So if a is equals to 0, what happens? You have that x plus 2 is equals to 0. Then you can solve for your x. So your x becomes equals to minus 2. The first case. Then the second case, you take b to be equals to 0. If you take b to be equals to 0, it means that x minus 4 is equals to 0. So you have x minus 4 to be equals to 0. So when you solve, you have an x minus 4 is equals to 0. So you have x now is equals to 4. So now that's the second case. Then the third case indeed may not be important, but if you want to look at it, you see the third case says a and b is equals to 0. So it means that a and b equals to 0. That is x plus 2 is equals to 0 and x minus 4 equals to 0. So if you treat the same case, it gives you that x is equals to 2 and x is equals to minus 4. Sorry, is equals to plus 4. And that is already the cases we have here. So that one is more or less a trivial case. So that's what we have. So what does this mean now? So how has this helped us? This has helped us to solve the quadratic equation. So if you see what we have done, we have solved a quadratic equation. So the quadratic equation now we have solved is that x is equals to minus 2 or x is equals to 4. So finally we say that x is equals to minus 2 or x is equals to 4. And that's what we have. Then let's give the interpretation further. So let's look at the interpretation. Now what it means is that, there are two x here. You have x here, you have another x. So that if you multiply, if you open up this bracket, you start having x squared. These two up there means there are two possible values of x that will satisfy this equation. What I mean by satisfying the equations, there are two possibles of x that when you plug in it here, it will give you 0. For instance, from what we have done now, we have gotten two values of x. X is minus 2, x is 4. So now if you take x equals to minus 2, we put it in the left hand side and see if it will correspond to 0 in the right hand side. So we start. So here is x plus 2, which is now minus 2 plus 2 in bracket, then times x minus 4. What is x? Minus 2 minus 4. So this will give us, in the first bracket, minus 2 plus 2 gives you 0. So 0 here, minus 2 minus 4 gives you minus 6. So what do you have? 0 times minus 6. And this will give us what? 0, which agrees with what we have on the right hand side. Then you test for the other x. So we test for x equals to 4 and see if it will give us the same thing. So we move on now and say x equals to 4. So x equals to 4 and see what it will give us. So in the first bracket, I have x, which is 4 plus 2. In the second bracket, I have x minus 4. Your x is 4 minus 4. So here in the first bracket, you have 6. In the second bracket, you have 0. So this is 6 times 0, which gives us 0. So what have we done? There are two possible values of x that when we put in this equation, it will give us 0. So that means that x is equals to minus 2 or 4. And that gives us the solution to this quadratic equation.